This is the Omnivore's Dilemma, Young Reader's Edition, Chapter 21, starting on page 286, Gathering the Fungi. To make my hunter-gatherer meal, I needed not only hunting skills, but gathering skills as well. Since my menu included mushrooms, I would need to learn yet another set of skills and join yet another club, the Semi-Secret Society of Wild Mushroomers. I found that club even more difficult to join than the Club of Hunters. Luckily, Angelo was once again going to be my guide. At first glance, mushroom hunting looks easy. You just go through the forest happily picking mushrooms, kind of like picking tomatoes in the garden. The only difference is you didn't have to plant, water, fertilize, and weed the mushrooms. They just grew all by themselves. Easy, right? Not so easy, as I was about to discover. For starters, I've never gotten lost in a garden. It's surprisingly easy to get lost when you're deep in the woods with your head down looking for wild mushrooms. Also, in the garden, you know where the vegetables are growing. Mushrooms hide from you. And of course, there's the whole poison thing. I never once worried that a cucumber I grew from seed would kill me if I ate it. But picking and eating the wrong mushroom can get you killed. Mushrooms, you soon discover, are wild things in every way. That's why people who go looking for them call it mushroom hunting, not harvesting. It was a Sunday morning in late January when I got a call from Angelo. "The chanterelles are up," he announced. "How do you know? Have you been out looking?" "No, not yet. But it's been 3 weeks since the big rains. They're up now, I'm sure of that. We should go tomorrow." At the time, I barely knew Angelo. We had yet to go pig hunting, so I was very grateful for the invitation. To a mushroom hunter, a good chanterelle spot is a closely guarded secret. Before Angelo agreed to take me, I'd ask a bunch of other mushroom hunters to take me along. Some of them acted like I had asked to borrow their credit card. Others promised to call me back, but never did. A few used the same old joke. "I could show you where I get my mushrooms, but then I'd have to kill you." Even Angelo wasn't really giving away a secret. The place he took me was on private and gated land owned by an old friend of his. No one could get onto it without permission from the owner. The chanterelle lives on the roots of wild oak trees, usually very old ones. There must have been hundreds of ancient oaks on the property, but Angelo seemed to know every one of them. That one there is a producer," he'd tell me, pointing across the meadow to a tree. "But the one next to it, I never once found a mushroom there." I set off across the meadow to hunt beneath the tree. I looked around for a few minutes, lifting the dead leaves with my stick, but I saw nothing. Then Angelo came over and pointed to a spot no more than a yard from where I stood. I looked, I stared, but still saw nothing but a mess of tan leaves. Angelo got down on his knees and brushed the leaves away to reveal a bright squash-colored mushroom the size of his fist. He cut it at the base with a knife and handed it to me. The mushroom was heavy and cool to the touch. How in the world had he spotted it? The trick, he explained, was to look for signs of something pushing up the leaves. Then you had to look at the ground sideways to see if you could catch a glimpse of the gold stems of the chanterelle. Yet when Angelo pointed to another spot under the same tree, a spot where he had seen another mushroom, I was still blind. Not until he moved the leaves with his stick did the golden nugget of fungus flash at me. I became convinced that Angelo must be smelling the chanterelles before he saw them. But that wasn't the case. I just had to learn how to look. The way the mushroom hunters put it is you put your eyes on. And after following Angelo around for a while, I did begin to put my eyes on a little. Before the morning was out, I'd begun to find a few chanterelles on my own. The mushrooms started to pop out of the landscape, one and then another. But after a brief run of luck, I promptly went blind again and failed to find another mushroom all day. I would say there were no more mushrooms left to find, except that Angelo was still finding them in spots I had just visited. I had managed to find just 5, though several of them weighed close to a pound each. My 5 chanterelles were tremendous, beautiful things I couldn't wait to taste. That night I washed off the dirt, patted them dry, and then sliced the chanterelles into creamy white slabs. They smelled faintly of apricots. I knew at once that this was the same mushroom I had found near my house, the one I had been afraid to taste. The orange color matched, and these had the same shallow ridges running up the stalk. I cooked them as Angelo had recommended, first in a dry frying pan to sweat out their water, and then with butter and shallots. The mushrooms were delicious, with a light flavor, fruity with a hint of pepper, and a firm but silky texture. And I wasn't the least bit concerned about waking up dead. What had happened to resolve my omnivore's dilemma? Even after reading guidebooks or looking at photographs on my own, I still wasn't sure I had a true chanterelle. But when Angelo handed one to me, my doubts vanished. I knew that the next time I found a chanterelle anywhere, I would recognize it and not hesitate to eat it. I spoke with other mushroom hunters who had the same experience. It seemed that we need to learn this information in person from another human being. Maybe that's part of our omnivore's instinct. It's certainly an advantage we have over the omnivore rat, which cannot share its hard-won knowledge of food with other rats. Mushrooms each have their seasons. Once the rain stopped in April, the chanterelles were done for the year. The next important mushroom hunt would be for the morels in May. I used the time in between to read about mushrooms and talk to mycologists. I had a lot of questions like, what made mushrooms come up when and where they did? Why do chanterelles live on oaks and morels on pines? Why under some trees and not others? I learned that there aren't a lot of answers to even the most basic questions. Scientists know very little about the fungi, which are the third kingdom of life on Earth. Part of the problem is simply that fungi are very difficult to observe. What we call a mushroom is only a small part of a fungus. Most of it is underground, consisting of a network of microscopic cells called mycelium. These thin, thread-like cells form a web buried in the soil. You can't dig up a mushroom to study it because the mycelium is too tiny and delicate. If you try to separate them from the soil, they just fall apart. We know the basic parts of a plant: roots, stem, leaves, flowers, but we don't even know for sure if fungi have parts, aside from mushrooms. We don't know exactly why or when the fungus produces a mushroom either. It can go years or even centuries without producing one. Thanks to chlorophyll, plants are able to transform sunlight, water, and minerals into carbohydrates. Fungi work sort of in reverse. They recycle organic matter with powerful enzymes that can break down organic molecules into simple molecules and minerals. A mycorrhizal fungus has cells that surround or even go into the roots of the plant. The fungus and the plants have a deal. The fungus gives the plant simple elements and minerals it has taken from the soil. In return, the plant gives the fungus a drop of the simple sugars, carbohydrates, it has made. The fungus cells reach far underground and so act as a second root system for the plant. Trees need these fungal networks to thrive. It is also possible that the fungus gives the tree protection from bacteria or other fungi. Fungi are an essential part of the life cycle on Earth. They are the masters of decay and recycling. Without fungi to break things down, the Earth would soon be covered with a blanket of dead plants and animals. That might be why some people just don't like mushrooms. Even the ones that don't poison us are closely linked to death and decay. Their job is to break the dead down into food for the living. That's much less appetizing than a plant that creates food from sunlight. Cemeteries are usually good places to hunt for mushrooms. Mexicans call mushrooms carne de los muertos, flesh of the dead. About those poisons, scientists aren't sure why some mushrooms produce them. The poison might be a defense against being eaten, or it might just be one of the chemicals the fungus needs to do its work that happens to be toxic to humans. As a food, fungi, or mushrooms, which are the part we eat, don't have much nutritional value. They contain some minerals, vitamins, and some amino acids, the building blocks of protein, but few calories. So mushrooms are not a good source of energy for us. Yet they have enough energy to do some amazing things. Consider. Through Angelo's friend, Jean-Pierre, I met another mushroom hunter named Anthony Tassanello. Anthony said he'd be willing to take me morel hunting. He wasn't too worried about keeping the spot secret since we would be hunting burn morels. These are morels that come up in the spring following a pine forest fire. The fire had been big news, and every mushroom hunter in California would be out looking for morels there. Plus, whatever spots we found would only be good for a couple of weeks. Anthony emailed that I should meet him in front of his house Friday morning at 6 o'clock sharp. He warned me to come prepared for any weather. We'll go rain, snow, or shine. He wasn't kidding. The weather up there where we would be going was extreme. It could be snow in May, or be very hot, or both in the same day. He also described the ground we would be covering. It's very steep and rocky, with huge burned fallen trees and ground that is thoroughly soaked. Bring a hat. The sun is stronger at this elevation. Plus, it keeps cedar needles and spider webs out of your face and can double as a mushroom sack when your basket is full. Anthony also advised me to bring sunscreen and bug spray for mosquitoes, at least a gallon of water, chapstick, and, if I owned one, a walkie-talkie. Suddenly, morel hunting didn't sound like much fun. In fact, it sounded more like survival training than a walk in the woods. I crossed my fingers that Anthony was just trying to scare me and set my alarm for 4:30 a.m. I wondered why it was all these mushroom hunting expeditions had to begin at such ungodly hours in the morning. I understood why you had to hunt pigs early in the day when they're active, but it's not as though these morels were going to disappear after lunch. Perhaps the idea is to use as much daylight as possible. Or maybe we wanted the early start to beat the other mushroomers to the best spots. I pulled up to Anthony's curb a little before 6 to find two 30-ish looking men in rain slickers loading an SUV. They were packing enough equipment for an expedition down the Amazon. Anthony was a rail-thin 6-footer with a goatee. His friend Ben Bailey was a somewhat rounder and softer man with an easy laugh. I learned on the long ride that Anthony and Ben were childhood friends from Piscataway, New Jersey. After college, they'd both moved to the Bay Area to become chefs. Anthony told me they were going to be joined by someone they'd met at the Burn the week before, a young guy known only to them by his mushrooming nickname, Paulie Porcini. Paulie Porcini was part of the subculture of mushroom hunters who travel up and down the West Coast. They follow the mushrooms as they appear, porcinis in the fall, chanterelles in winter, morels in the spring. These are people living out of vans, Ben explained. They make a living selling their mushrooms to brokers who set up shop in motel rooms near the forests. The brokers put up signs to let the mushroomers know where they are, and they pay cash. Then they resell the mushrooms to restaurants and food stores. We drove for several hours and gradually climbed into the mountains of the El Dorado National Forest. The forest is a 1,200 square mile swath of pine and cedar stretched between Lake Tahoe and Yosemite. As we rose, the temperature dropped down into the 30s and a frozen rain began to pelt the windshield. Snow covered the ground. It was early May, but we had driven back into winter. We were looking for the edge between the snow and bare ground. That's where the morels would be growing. At an elevation of about 4,500 feet, we found it. We parked the SUV and looked around. Soon after, Paulie Porcini appeared. He was a bearded, quiet fellow in his 20s who carried a walking stick and had a bandana wrapped around his head. He seemed like someone who was very comfortable in the woods. The forest was beautiful, and it was ghastly. As far as you could see, it was a graveyard of black, soaring trunks. For 5 days the previous October, the power fire, as it was called, had roared across these mountains, consuming 17,000 acres of pine and cedar. The fire had been so fierce in places that it had eaten trees down to the roots. This left blackened holes where the trees had stood. Not much lived in this landscape. We heard owls and saw a few squirrels. That was basically the last time all day I lifted my gaze to take in the view. As soon as Ben announced he'd spotted his first morel, I began looking down. The ground was covered with a thick carpet of pine needles and the charred trunks of pine. A morel resembles a tan finger wearing a dark and deeply honeycombed dunce cap. They'd be easy to spot if they weren't brown and black. As it was, they seemed to disappear against the forest floor. To help me get my eyes on, Ben began leaving in place patches of morels he'd found so I could study them where they grew. I found that if I actually got down on the ground, I could see the little hats popping up here and there. From above, they were invisible. Of course, the ground was thick, black mud, but that seemed to be the price you paid for burned morels. The morning was spent wandering across the steep hillside with our heads down, my gaze locked on a point about 6 steps in front of me. Wandering around that way, I completely lost track of where I was. To regain my bearings, I'd have to stop and look up. The air was foggy, and the hills were cut with deep ravines. I often had no idea in which direction the road was or where the others had wandered. Every now and then a burst of static would come over my walkie-talkie. "I've hit a mother lode down here by the creek," or "Where the hell are you guys?" When I did see morels, it didn't feel like I had found them. It felt more like they had decided to show themselves. There's something mushroomers call the pop-out effect. Here's how it works. When searching for something, you fix its visual pattern in your mind. Then it seems to pop out of the background. You don't need to play these tricks when looking for fruits and vegetables. They depend on animals to eat them and spread their seeds, so they have evolved to be noticed. In the garden, nobody hides. Nobody means you harm. Everything in the garden, or almost everything, is there because the gardener wants it there. Gathering in the forest is a very different thing. We didn't create the forest. It does not exist for us. The morels would just as soon as I passed them by. Even the bright berries aren't growing there for us. We didn't work to make the forest happen. It's more like we're stealing from it. Alone in the woods, out of earshot of my fellow mushroom hunters, I found myself, idiotically, talking to the morels. Whenever a bunch of them suddenly popped out, I would cry, "Gotcha!" You would never feel like that with an apple tree in an orchard. Of course the apples are there. A farmer had planted them. I'd completely lost track of time and space when my walkie-talkie blurted, "Break for lunch, meet back at the car." I had wandered nearly a mile from the car, mostly downhill. By the time I worked my way back up to the road, the others were standing around munching trail mix. They had pretty impressive hauls. "You couldn't have picked a better day," Ben gushed when I wandered over with my own bag full of morels. "The mushrooms are so on today. I've never seen it like this. We're killing it." We sat on a charred log. By now, we all looked charred ourselves, and ate our lunch, talking about the mushrooms and the people who made their living as mushroom hunters. People have been gathering morels in burned forests forever. Ben mentioned that in Germany long ago, people would set forest fires just so they could harvest morels. Scientists think that morels are a mycorrhizal species that lives on the roots of the pine trees. When the pine dies in a fire, the fungi face a crisis. Suddenly, there are no more roots supplying them with food. So the fungus fruits, sending up morels to release trillions of spores. It's up to the wind to spread the spores far from the blasted forest. The morels are trying to escape the dying forest. Yet at the same time, they also help it grow back. The slightly meaty odor of morels attracts flies, which lay eggs in the safety of the mushroom's hollow stalk. Larvae hatch and feed on the flesh of the morels. Birds then return to the forest to feed on the larvae. The birds drop seeds that sprout on the forest floor, beginning the process of regeneration. After lunch, we wandered off on our separate ways again for a few more hours. I worked my way downhill, slip-sliding in the mud and following a stream that led to Beaver Creek. I had no idea where I was or where I was going. I was following the trail of mushrooms. Along Beaver Creek that afternoon, the morels were totally on, as Ben would say. Almost everywhere I looked, the dunce caps appeared, and I filled a bag in less than an hour. I had no idea how deep into the woods I'd wandered, and I was more than a little lost, but not to the morels, who weren't hiding from me any longer. I felt again the gratitude I had felt in that other forest, the moment that wild pig first appeared to me on the top of that ridge. It can be hard work, hunting and gathering, but if you come away with something, it's almost by chance. You don't feel your hard work has been rewarded. You feel more like you're getting something for nothing, a gift. By the end of the afternoon, we'd all ended up down by Beaver Creek. Around 4, we made our way back to the car. We changed our soaking socks on the tailgate and filled the entire cargo area of the SUV with morels. We tried as best we could to hide them from view. No reason really, but a big haul of mushrooms just isn't something you want to advertise. Earlier that afternoon, a couple of mushroom hunters in an old van stopped to ask if I was having any luck. For no good reason, I had lied through my teeth. We'd found 60 pounds of morels, it turned out, a personal best for Anthony and Ben. Before we climbed into the car to head home, we asked a hiker to take a picture of the 4 of us holding a crate loaded with morels, a huge one propped on the top of the pile. We were filthy and exhausted, but felt rich as kings.